So we're 8:01. I think we are going to get going. Happy to have everybody here this morning. And yes, we will be using Menti again. So please just take a peek at the chat there and see that. Everybody here, if you've joined us before, knows myself and Jenny. Joining us this morning, very happy to have John Partington, who's our Associate Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here at SAIT. I'm very excited to have John join us for this conversation this morning. I think based on the registration numbers, highly anticipated and a very important conversation that everybody wants to take part in. So thank you for that. As we get going, we will be using the chat and the Q&A. So, if you're not familiar with Zoom, if you haven't been on Zoom in the past 20 months, congratulations. But feel free to find the chat. If it's your first time here, throw a number 1 in the chat. If you've been here before, throw a 2 in. Feel free to, as we go through, use the Q&A function for the questions, because as you can see, the chat just flies by when you start rolling in here. But as we do every week, we like to start with land recognition, and we're going to turn it over to John this morning for that. So John, thanks for joining us, and over to you to kick things off.
Sounds good. Thank you, Craig. Thanks for having me, Jenny, and good morning, everyone. Happy Friday. It's been a very busy week for us on campus here, so I'm sure it's been the same for you all. Counting down to the holiday break, so that will be good. I will be taking on the acknowledging of traditional territories. And so this is an important small gesture with large impact. SAIT recently updated its land acknowledgement for many reasons, but the most of which was to really make this a gesture of truth and reconciliation. And so it's not an administrative checkbox for us. I really encourage our fellow staff members to make this their own in some way and make it personal and authentic. For me, I really take this on as a way to learn the names of the places of the first peoples who were here in Calgary, and then use that as a jumping off point to learn more about the histories and cultures of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta. So with that, let's get started. Oki, Ambawathtik, Danidada, Tansi, hello. SAIT would like to acknowledge that we are meeting virtually, of course, on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, including the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai First Nations. We're also on the lands of the Tsuut'ina First Nation, the Stoney Nakoda First Nation, and the homeland of the Northwest Métis Region number 3. And I think that this image here of the river that looks like the bow, probably on Princess Island Park, is a really fitting way to acknowledge the lands upon which we gather, we work, and we play. So with that, Craig, back to you.
Perfect. Thank you, John. And Emily in the chat, bang on. Really well done, John. I appreciate that. We were chatting before we got on here about the pronunciations, and I think good on you for really taking that to heart and doing it well. So thank you for that. As we start, why don't we just simply start with definitions to level set, John? So when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and perhaps we can also just touch on the difference, if there is any, between DEI and EDI, as we kind of see these items float back and forth. So why don't we start there? Let's go with the definitions and then just the differences.
Fair enough. Yeah, it's a good foundation to start with. I mean, many folks on this call, probably part of the reason why you've joined on today. Equity, diversity, and inclusion have become such buzzwords. We see them everywhere in business, in the public sector, and they mean everything and nothing at the same time. They've kind of been emptied out a little bit. So I'll give the definitions that SAIT uses as our baseline. How does that sound? So let's start with diversity. So that's really about the unique experiences, perspectives, and identities that we have as people. It's what makes us different and what makes us similar. When we talk about inclusion, it's the intentional process of making sure that everyone feels welcome, respected, and empowered to succeed. Now, this is not something that just happens. You can put a bunch of diverse people in a room, but it doesn't mean they're going to feel those 3 things and more. It's something you've got to continually work at and be very intentional and proactive about. Now, the last one is quite tricky. So equity. Equity is not the same as equality. I find that those 2 terms are often confused and conflated. So equity is really what we want. It's about fairness. It's making sure everyone has a fair chance to access, participate, and be successful in all the great things that we offer at SAIT, for example, or in the companies that have signed on with us today. Equality is when you treat everyone the same. And so at first glance, that might seem like the right thing to do, but when we do that, we often reinscribe barriers that exist in new ways without even realizing it. The barriers could be at an interpersonal level, it could be at a systemic level. So equity acknowledges, one, that those barriers exist, but then number two, it works to dismantle those things to make sure that there's a fair playing field for all. So that's a real quick definition.
Excellent.
Yeah.
No, I appreciate that. And then just to kind of touch on, and then Jenny will jump into the Menti after this, but just the difference here between DEI and EDI, and does it matter, I guess, is the other part of that.
Sure. Yeah, I've seen many different acronyms. I've seen DEI, EDI, or IDEA as well, adding A at the end for accessibility. I've also seen JEDI for you Star Wars fans on the call. The J standing for justice, put at the very beginning. So yeah, there are many floating around. I would say DEI is more of an American slant taken on the acronym. I'm seeing that a lot in American discourse, especially in the corporate world. But it all depends really what you want to focus on. So usually the alignment is due to that. So for us at SAIT, equity is kind of the guiding principle, the thing that we definitely want to achieve, and the others kind of fall into place. So for us, it's EDI first. But it all depends on the approach that the organization takes and really what their priorities are, I would say.
Excellent. Perfect. Well, thanks for that, because we were chatting before and I wasn't sure. I always found it interesting. So Jenny, why don't we pop into the Menti then? And this can help get the conversation going, and we'll see where it goes. So folks, again, as Jenny's loading that up, we can certainly, the chat I see has already started with some comments, and if there's any questions that come up as we go along, please do throw them into the Q&A. So menti.com, and then your code is 33895913, and we're seeing all sorts of thumbs up scrolling across the screen there. A few hearts as well. There you go.
Touch one of those. There we go.
There.
So for a lot of people, this will kick it off. If you're having trouble getting in on your phone, if you're using your phone or that second browser, this is what you should now see on that screen. Should be easy to get in. We can see the numbers coming up pretty quickly here. I'll just pop it in the chat one more time because I'm going to move the slide on. So if you were late in or later in and you have no idea what we're talking about, menti.com on a separate browser or on your cell phone. We won't steal your data away from you as long as you're in Wi-Fi. And once you get in, you'll see this, although we're going to change it now to just check in. We always do an easy one to start with so that you can see how Menti works. So on your device or your browser now, you'll have a number of choices. I have a feeling I let you pick at least two here if you like. We actually have a bit of light here now. I can see the weather out here. Those of you who are halfway through your day, if you're somewhere else, you might be in a different setting.
A few people surrounded by water this morning, it would appear.
Yes. I'm wondering if that's our English contingent or whether that's people west of us here, because they have had a terrible time with water recently. And anybody who's now singing that song about weather being frightful, I do apologize. It might stay with you for the rest of the day. And we're getting close. We'll just let it run for a few more seconds to let everybody climb in. So this is how Menti works. I believe on all the slides, if there's an option, you're welcome, Avery. I've let you put in more than one choice. Most of the time, we will have a word cloud one. You can just keep submitting it. I'll remind you of that. Tavin, I'm sorry, no warm and sunny option. I didn't even think of it. Wasn't top of mind. Whoops, sorry about that. Okay, let's move on to the next three are all to do with EDI, of course. And our first one talks to just you within your company or the organization that you work with. These are slides, so you can pick between whether it's been, you absolutely agree EDI has been important, maybe it hasn't, maybe it's been completely elusive, and you can do one for each of those three slides. We get a moment to be mesmerized by the colors going up and down.
Interesting. Yeah, I just watching this change here. I'm not surprised by what I'm seeing so far. I don't know about you, John or Jenny, but clearly from the fact that we've been putting more of an effort on this at SAIT, by evidence, obviously, of your position, John, and your importance into the strategic plan that we've put in place around this. It's not surprising to see these results. It's good to see.
Definitely, yeah. There's been an explosion as of late, especially in the past 2 years, just with the pandemic. So, yeah. But there have been some longstanding, real trailblazing companies and organizations. So I think we're seeing that here too.
Yeah. And Nikki with an interesting comment here about, EDI has been spoken about, but not a lot of action. And hopefully we can address some things that you might be able to do today to help with the action. For the public service, it seems like it was just a checkbox. It's perhaps a bit unfortunate, but again, maybe we can leave today with some ideas that help move it outside the box, so to speak. So, yeah. And then Patty, EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion. Brent's throwing some interesting comment there. It's a lot for me to read off all at once, but I will let everybody take a peek. Because Jenny, I think we can pop to the next one.
Sure, we were still moving there. We'll get it on here for a second. There we go. So this one is our word cloud. If we say to you inclusive leadership, what springs to mind? As John said at the beginning, this is intentional. And I think that's what makes it elusive in some places, because it's easy to talk about. You have to be intentional. It's hard work every day. It's just, it's culture. It's just like you and I were talking the other week, Craig. So when we say inclusive leadership, what words spring to mind for you? There's one of our favorite ones in here.
Yeah.
Now, this is a word cloud. You can keep adding in these. So if you've submitted once and then you see words that you like on the screen, you can copy them, stick them in again. The more often it pops up, the more bold and bigger that word will become.
I thought keeping track of the chat was hard.
Catch up.
Yeah, psychological empathy, obviously, empathetic. I'm seeing that a lot. Understanding, that's listening.
Some big pieces in it. Yeah.
Anything jumping out at you, John, as you're watching this pod? Like my 2020 vision is not 2020.
That's all right. I think we've got a pretty informed group. I mean, look at all of this, right? This is great. Yeah, much of the components are captured here. And I think what's most important is the way that they start to intersect and combine together, which I know we'll get into. So we've got a good foundation to jump from for sure.
Absolutely. We'll let this run for just a couple of seconds more. We won't give anybody motion sickness. I keep seeing belonging pop up in there, and I like that. I forget whose it is, but there's that, diversity brings you to the table, inclusion gives you a voice, and belonging means you're heard. I don't know who said that, but it's a key piece that I think sort of is part of the conversation.
I see authentic in here as well. That one's jumping out at me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Interesting. Yeah, very interesting. All right. Thank you.
We're going to move on. I think this would just keep going and going and going. We will. Somebody's got coffee in there, and I wonder if that's to do with making the time for the conversations that need to happen. And that's another piece that we often don't make the time for. We've one more. We'll move on now. And this one just simply asks you, who do you know that demonstrates inclusive leadership? And Carly, I will get that in the chat for you.
Or we can make sure we throw it out in the follow-up materials too, Jen, if you want.
Very few.
All right. Let's try to remain politically neutral here this morning.
That's our job.
Yeah, that's right.
I'll keep these scrolling. It's going to be difficult to keep up with them. And John, to invite you in here, but I think at the point of asking this question is there are people out there who are already doing this really effectively, and sort of watching, learning from that modeling could be a supportive part of the conversation.
I think so, yeah. I mean, this is the power of role models and for representation as well. This is something that has developed over time, just by attending the 45-minute session with us this morning, and taking away a few ideas. Unfortunately, it's not so simple. You learn over time, you learn by making mistakes. Interactions with people, they can be messy, they can be confusing, they can be a little bit awkward, and that's all part of the journey. This is a process, not a destination. So lots of that to keep in mind.
Yeah, I like that. I like the fact that you've keyed on it being a process, John, because I think part of the challenge with some of these initiatives, or when, not to say there's a problem with an EDI initiative, what I'm saying is that part of the challenge, I think, sometimes is when an organization or a group says we're going to focus on this, it then becomes very much treated like an on-off switch. We're either doing it or we're not, right? And have we achieved it or haven't we? And I think that might be one of the places, if organizations or individuals struggle with this topic, is that it's not that, right? And I don't know if that just stirs any thoughts or comments for you, but it is, to your point, it is a process. And so how do you start setting those expectations to, what are the markers, what are the goals? Everybody, we all tend to be so goal achieved. So how do we know when we've done it or when we're doing it, right?
Right.
Yeah, I think you get my question. I'm kind of rambling there, so I'll let you.
No, I understand. Yeah, that's a common pitfall that many organizations succumb to without even realizing it. I like to say this is a mindset, not a program. A program is something that you run from time to time. You can turn it off and turn it on when it's convenient. But a mindset is a way of thinking, a way of doing, a way of feeling, and a way of making decisions and taking action. So that gives it a more long-term scope. I think it's a lens upon which you can apply everything that you do, regardless of where you work, in what kind of organization, or what kind of industry. So that's the distinction, I think, that's very important.
Yeah, I like that. Jenny, any thoughts?
Yeah, no, I agree completely. And I was actually going to suggest that we, John, let's pull one of your slides up. We're not big slide users in here, but there's a phenomenal graphic for this that you had. I'm just going to pray for technology here. There we go. And yeah, I think this will be useful to people to see, often when we say mindset, our heads go to, okay, I just have to think this way. And that's where that on off comes from, because we're not very good at that, I don't think. And this gives us, like, I love the alliteration, but 6 different areas where we can actually start to lean into that. We're coming back to what you said originally, John, this is hard work. And how do we stay on top of these, and how do you keep that mindset going, and what comes first? Like, where do I start? If I'm suddenly sitting here having looked at all of those mentees, I'm following the chat, and I'm like, I don't think I'm an inclusive leader. Where's the best place to start here, do you think?
Yeah, great question. I would say you start with self. You start with introspection. And so that would fall under the first C at the top there in yellow: cognizance, looking within, understanding the pieces of your own identity and what biases might be attached to those, and then think about it in relation to others. That's kind of, the start point, I would say.
I like that. And I think so much of good leadership starts with you've got to know who you are and where you're coming from. And some of it's what's your story too. What was involved as you came to this piece, and how do we do that self-awareness? How do we look at ourselves? We're very often driven by, yes, I know my values, I know my boundaries, I'm good. And what this tells us is there's so much more beneath that we have to make space for. Yeah, I like the courage one on there, John. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? I think that's a very big competency in this field.
Yes,
it is. Just quickly, Jenny, as I think you're the host, can you see if you can turn on the captioning?
Oh yeah. Give me a minute, I'll try.
Thank you.
I'll let you guys talk. We'll see if we can find it.
Yeah, I think it's just one of the buttons at the bottom for you, Jenny.
Yeah, I got it, I think.
Perfect. Yes, courage. This is hard work. This is not easy to do. And often this is not a linear process either. I think we should flag that. I mean, in my experience of doing this work for 2 years in particular at SAIT, I mean, it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, sometimes 1 step sideways. So you have to stay the course. And it takes courage and strength from within to be able to Be comfortable with being uncomfortable, for calling out to discrimination or unfair systems or interactions between people. It's not easy to do those kinds of things. It's much easier to be a bystander and allow the status quo to continue. So courage is a big piece to stay the course and keep going, and to be brave at the same time.
And I think, and remembering that conversation we had the other week, Craig, like that bystander piece, what are you prepared to tolerate? And actually, that bystander could be sort of catastrophic to a team, a department, and beyond, actually, when we don't take action.
Absolutely. You mind throwing that slide back up again, Jenny? Because I think there was a couple of really good points in there. And John, maybe we can kind of tie this back to the mentee as well. We asked folks what inclusive leadership meant to them, but how do you define inclusive leadership? What would you say when you look at somebody who's leading a group or a team to say, yeah, that person's got it. They know what they're doing in this area.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. So I will say this framework is by Deloitte, and it's one of my favorites, and so we have cited them here. So I didn't create this, but I am quite fond of it, and I appreciate how the 6 pieces start to morph and mold together. That's what I like the most about it. But I would say an inclusive leader is someone who takes these 6 attributes or traits and really makes it their own in a way that's authentic to them. Employees especially can sniff out inauthenticity very easily. If you're forever a politician as a leader, you got to play that game a little bit, but we need to see your genuine side in these 6 ways. I would say at its best, when you can be an inclusive leader trying to embody these traits, you really create the conditions in a workplace in which everyone can develop, progress, be paid equitably, treated fairly, and feel like they belong. Jenny, you keyed in on belonging during our mentee. And so when I say belonging, what I mean is an employee feels that they can bring their full self to work. They can be their authentic self openly in the workplace. And then that is valued and also contributes to their levels of engagement. So I think an inclusive leader really sets the conditions like that in the ways that they, over the systems and things that they have influence or impact over. We'll go through some different criteria of what an inclusive workplace looks like. As a leader, you're not going to have control over all 10 of those things, but I'm sure there's at least 1 or 2 that you touch in your daily work. And so it's really about being strategic on what can I really influence and have the biggest impact, whether it be structures or the climate of the workplace or both.
Perfect.
I think that's an important.
Go ahead, Jenny.
Sorry, I just wanted to catch something that John had said there. It's about providing the conditions. It's about the environment, and that we've talked about that a lot, is how that's a leader's role, is sort of making space, making the conditions and the environment available for people to show up. If they haven't been doing that for a number of years, they're not suddenly going to turn up as a different version of them. That's a choice on the people side, but we have a responsibility to open up those conditions and make that environment, make it possible, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was a couple comments back here early on. Mary Beth, thanks. It's about culture and behavior, just like safety. We should be intervening when we see it not happening, right? And I think that's super important. And thank you also, Mary Beth, for throwing in the link to the Deloitte article piece there. That's awesome. And Carrie, yeah, vulnerability clearly comes into play here as well. So how do you know when, and we can perhaps then get to the items that you wanted to talk about there, John, but how do you know when a leader is doing this well? And what does it look like when they're missing the mark? Right. Well, it might be easier to point that out, unfortunately, but.
Sure. Yeah, so you see it in the levels of engagement in their team, you see it in the climate, and I think you can also find different clues in the structures as well. So, for example, do your teammates or your colleagues or those whom report to you feel comfortable being their authentic self openly? If not, that's something I would take pause with to really dig into why. Psychological safety was mentioned. Do people feel comfortable sharing different perspectives and points of view? Do you have open conversations about disagreeing, productively? Are people feeling comfortable enough to share that? If not, something's going on in your team culture as well. I would say when it comes to the structure side, someone made a comment in here around pay. You know, we should be paid fairly if we have the experience and the education and our roles are similar. I would say if you kind of lift up the hood of the truck, as it were, in many organizations, you will see large disparities between people based on their identities. If you haven't ever looked at your pay equity, there's something going on there. Structurally, you know, what are the policies and procedures that have created such a disparity in the first place? That's one thing to look at. I would also say representation. Look at who is in what roles. We always want to choose the most qualified candidate, of course, but if you don't have a diverse talent pool, there's something going on there. You're not searching hard enough. You're not casting your net wide enough. To say that there are no diverse, talented candidates who can fill leadership roles, I don't buy that. I think you got to look in different places. You got to search different channels. Your leadership should be representative of the populations whom you serve. So for us at SAID, as a public post-secondary institution, the city of Calgary, and then of course the world at large. The city is very diverse and increasingly so over the years. And we see that in our student population, it follows the same pattern. So when we look at our leadership, sometimes we don't see that reflection and there is a disconnect going on.
Wow, there's a lot there to unpack.
Yeah.
Jenny?
How come Jenny has no words? Come on. But yeah, actually, I think there's a number of key elements in there that companies, organizations, and teams are actually really waking up to. And it feels to me like we're caught in a bit of a legacy piece because we built, you know, if we think a lot of the institutions that we have or the organizations that we have that are very heavily still built on hierarchy. And now there seems to be a wake up really as to, you know, as you said, John, I don't buy that. And so we're doing our very best to meet those, I was going to say meet those parameters, but it really is just creating a better culture. It's that inclusive culture and looking at it. And so I think there's a bit of a time lag in there. And I'm curious too, I hear this all the time. Leaders who are, say, frontline leaders or middle leaders are doing their very, very best. And they're working on the, you know, when they're hiring, they're looking beyond what they've ever looked at. They're challenging their perspective. They're challenging their biases. This exists. Okay, what do I do to challenge that? And yet they seem to hit a ceiling when it goes up in those organizations. I'm wondering if you have any sort of comment on that. If I'm a leader and I feel stuck because I'm doing my best, but I'm not getting that coming down, what do I do then?
Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, for me, culture change initiatives are successful when that behavior and role modeling starts at the very top with your senior leaders. You know, if you don't have that, that's an enormous piece you're missing, and it will hinder your change efforts, no doubt about it. There's really not a way around it, unfortunately. I think, you know, everyone is at a different stage of their journey. So if you have senior leaders who are, you know, more to the beginning of the process, that's okay. You can nudge them intentionally along the way. You know, you can't force feed people. You can't force them to change or do. So you can start to nudge, you know, if they're not starting to think about it themselves, you know, especially with the power dynamics at play, you really can't control their behavior. You can influence them. But if they are firm not in changing, then you might want to think about, is the organization the right place for you?
Yeah. We've touched that button a number of times in these conversations. And I like that too. It's a little bit like that psychological safety conversation. It really does take, in the beginning, just one leader. So I think the key sort of suggestion here is don't stop just because you're not getting that support to start with. I like that nudge upwards and keep doing what you do at your level, because it is and will make a difference there.
Yeah, and it goes back to the point that you made earlier, John, about this being a process, right? Or a process, depending on how you want to go at it. But it's not going to change overnight. There's a comment here, Mary Beth, thank you again, about the role that unconscious bias plays in this area. And I'm curious, John, if you wanted to, and Jenny, just perhaps touch on that. And think, for me, the unconscious bias also speaks to blind spots that, you know, as a leader, you may or may not have. And so I think there's something tied together in those thoughts that I think plays heavily in this subject. So thoughts?
Sure. Do you want me to take that first, Jenny, or? Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to acknowledge we all have bias. it is a function of our brain. It's a biological change. We did this fight or flight. This is an evolutionary thing. We do it to conserve energy. We put people into categories because it's an efficient way to, process thoughts. So I think the first thing is to acknowledge we all have bias, and, don't feel bad. You're not a bad person if you have bias or feel guilty about it. But it's also not an excuse to say, well, bias is natural. There's not much I can do about it. You do have to start to unpack where that functions within yourself and how. Now, having said that, in the heat of the moment, making decisions, it's very difficult to be able to stop and take stock of all of those different pieces that are at play in the background. So that is really where the structures come in to mitigate those things. So, for example, if you're on a hiring panel for a senior leader position and you are the hiring manager, you can be very intentional about the different points of view that you bring along to make those decisions that might catch or fill in some of those blind spots that you have yourself. If you're going to bring in a bunch of people who are very similar to you, who think the same way, I think we know what the outcome is going to be. So it's about trying to be proactive in making those structures that will mitigate the decisions and the biases that come into that. But it's very difficult.
I think there's a couple of interesting components in there. Unconscious bias training drives me crazy. It doesn't fix it. That's your checkbox piece there. And what I like, what you're saying, John, is that structural part. So how do we put those structural pieces in? I have bias, of course I do, but now I'm aware that I have bias. I have a choice to take action. And we're right back to that. People make choices make culture. And so how do I put those structural, whether it's somebody else to hold me accountable, somebody else to challenge me, who's on that committee, and to really put that into place. I think last time I read it, there's something like 144 biases that we all carry pretty commonly. Come on, we all have bias. So how do we set that structure up? I like that angle.
Yeah, and how do you find people on your team to help you check your biases too? I think is an interesting piece as a leader that you can, and probably something I'm guilty of not doing enough of now that I say it out loud. But I think that's an obvious step that folks can take a look at. Tim, thank you for that. Tim's thrown something in here on a Harvard implicit bias assessment that can be taken. So sorry, John, I see you nodding. You like that one? Okay, good.
That one is also free. There's no charge to take those, so that helps.
Perfect. Question earlier, and I is to say, how do you suggest dealing with generational differences within the workplace and people who are really caught in the old boys club mentality? Something that may or may not exist more in certain industries than others, but I'm curious if either of you have some thoughts on that one.
Yeah, I have one comment to share, and then Jenny, I'll pass to you. I mean, I think it's important when we have this conversation. This is no longer a nice to have. It's not an extra sprinkle on top of your core business. It needs to be embedded and woven within. I mean, if you want to stay relevant as an organization in this day and age, this is something you must focus on. It's no longer a choice. I think your organization will be left behind very quickly if you don't. The world demands it, especially given the past 2 years and all the social, cultural things that have happened. And so, I think there's a huge risk to the organization in many ways, should you not take this seriously. But Jenny, please.
It's a really difficult, it's that legacy piece that I was talking about beforehand. We can see in the chat construction, other industries as well. And where's your circle of influence? Are there places where you can nudge? Are there places where you can drive a little bit of accountability? Often it's not much. I learned a great term. I don't know if she's here today. I did see her name on our list. Deb Herlock is a phenomenal leader in this space. And she taught me the term compassionate accountability. And as you said, John, those conversations are essential. Where can you have the conversation? What can you do to nudge in that space and help open up the conversation a little bit? Where it's thick and fast, it's thick and fast. And we're right back to what you said at the beginning. Is that something that I choose to work for? And I think that ties into what we're seeing post-pandemic. A lot of people have woken up and said, you know what, this isn't what I choose to do. And so we're not seeing, you know, the great resignation that everybody keeps saying, but we are seeing shifts where people are making different choices. And this is one of the bases that they're making those choices on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And yes, Colleen, you're absolutely right. There was a bias in my question there. You know, generational is just not an old boys club. It's the tech industry seems to be very much skewed to the younger side as well. So
Yeah,
really, really great point. There's a couple other things here I want to get to in the chat. John, any specific resources out there to help frame or define organizational policy for folks who may just be wading into this?
Sure. There's a few great organizations that I work with or have been trained by who are great. One is the CCDI, the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion. They do a lot of great work with most of Canada's top companies, I would say. They have some courses, they have an audit. You can bring in their consulting services for pretty affordable prices given the work that they do. So shout out to the CCDI, they are excellent. I'm just thinking, Craig, if people are looking for, you know, tangible tools, or even Jenny, could you pull up the journey map that I included? I think that visual is really good to start illustrating this.
just pause a second for technology. It's coming. There you go.
Yeah,
Is that the one?
That's the one. Yeah,
Okay.
excellent. Yeah, so this I think is really helpful to. I'm a very visual person, the way I operate and the way that I learn, and so I really like this. This is change management. This is very similar to ProSci. I'm sure we have some practitioners or folks who are knowledgeable about that here. This is the journey for most organizations, and so many are in the blue half of this equation here. Some are in the transition stage. From what I see in the literature that I read, very few are in the green side, in the welcoming or the inclusive organization. And so if you're looking to, you know, really plot where you are on this journey and where you want to get to, I would use this path as a map to get there. And, you know, tying this back to the topic of inclusive leadership, inclusive leaders are what move the needle forward. This is how you move from stage to stage. Now, keep in mind, it's incremental and slow, but this is kind of where you want to go. So, for example, on the far right, an inclusive organization is one where employees are their authentic selves openly, where you have psychological safety, where you have a performance-driven culture, where barriers are identified and removed, where you have dynamic, diverse teams, where trust is a given. Other things, I kind of mentioned this before, but hiring, promotion, and pay is done equitably and empowers as many people as you can. You have that representation and you really equip employees to work across differences. So for me, that's really the guiding principles that I work to for our organization. Of course, ours is unique in the sense that our stakeholders are employees, but more importantly, and just as important, our students. So we have different stakeholder bodies that are huge and have different needs. So we try to juggle all of that as we go forward.
Yeah, that's Mary Beth. I hope that helps. And the resources will come out here afterwards as well. There's a couple, I'm just looking at the time, this is flown by. There's a couple of questions I want to get to, John. Adrian had one up earlier in the chat. And I think it really speaks to, you know, how do you manage teams or team members who struggle with coming along on this EDI journey? You know, I appreciate you said it's not no longer a nice to have, it's a need to have. But it seems, you know, to your point of that last slide, that tolerance of differences, I believe, is the, like, how does a leader get folks through that piece? And maybe sometimes you don't get them through. Maybe they just end up falling out of the box because that's the direction you have to go.
Yeah, I mean, depending on the person, you know, if you have that grassroots groundswell coming up and the culture change is happening, they might decide that it's not the right organization for them. Their values don't align anymore. You know, the groundswell is such that it's moving in a different direction. So sometimes it's, you know, their time to move on or to retire or whatever it might be. But I think you have to be mindful of the person or the audience that you're working for. So for some people, it's data, it's facts. Hit them with the business case and all the ways that diverse teams are more profitable, more innovative, you know, more efficient. They have a larger market share, whatever it's going to take. Some people, they need that. Show them the data and the facts. There's much literature out there that I can provide later if necessary to do that. But for others, it's more about people. Start with storytelling, make it real, bring it into their world. I'm sure that they know someone in their family, in their extended family, in their larger friend groups, that this is important to in a certain way. And so telling stories like that, it makes it meaningful, you know, and capturing those in a way to show the before and the after. And here's what we've done, and here's why it's important. There's two offerings anyway.
Yeah. Jenny, any thoughts?
I think too, absolutely agree with what John said, and coming slightly down to a more in the weeds level, you know, my husband and I learn everything from our kids, I think, and our greatest teacher is our 13-year-old at the moment. She is phenomenal in this space. I learn from her every day. And that learning piece is share what you're learning. And we've talked about before creating a culture of learning. This is part of learning. So I noticed recently somebody was holding an EDI moment at the beginning of their meeting, as well as their safety moments side by side right there. And I think I heard the gentleman who was talking was talking about what he'd learned recently, and share what you're learning. And when we're talking about learning, we're talking about the stuff that doesn't go right as well. And we don't get it right all the time, but that's part of this. And the other one I would add out there, and again, taught by my super mentor in this area, is just have the courage to call people in. And calling in is really different than calling out. And so that's just a one-on-one conversation later. I don't know if you noticed, this was the comment, this could be the impact. And let's just start sharing those conversations and making space and time for them.
Yeah, I really like that. And I know we've started at our management council in the last little while, including an EDI moment at the beginning as well. And there's been some really interesting stories and learnings that have come out of that. So it's certainly a very useful approach. One last question I want to get to. I'm just very cognizant of time. There's a lot in the chat, and folks, we will try and go through the questions that have come up in the chat and share some thoughts going out on the follow-up material. But, you know, we've talked a little bit about how to deal with those who can't come along. I think a lot of leaders go into this with truly noble intent of, you know, trying to be very positive and making these EI initiatives successful. What do you do if you screw up as a leader, right? And I think, you know, there are times that probably in this area, folks are trying to be very careful in their language or very careful in their approach, and some folks are just human and may mess up because their biases emerge, right? So what do you do when you screw up as a leader in this area, John?
Yeah, important not if you make a mistake, but when. It is inevitable. Everybody does, myself included. It's part of the process. I mean, I don't think we should be naive here. Let's, you know, put all cards on the table. The reason why this work is so difficult is because, number one, usually your efforts are never enough. There's always more to do. And regardless of what you do, someone will be offended. They don't agree with the approach you've taken. Something is missing. You can't please everyone all the time. And so, you know, you do need to have a thick skin, I would say, and always commit to doing better, hear that feedback, and then, you know, use it in an agile, continuous process of improvement. But yes, when you make a mistake, this is where reflective practice comes in for me, in my opinion. So Jenny, there is a model I can share if you could pull it up for us, please. And it's called CLAIM. And so I've used this a few times. I can think of a really good example I can share if we want. So when you make a mistake in the moment, if someone calls you out because you've offended them or you've done something that they don't like, the first thing you want to do is center yourself. That is to say, collect your emotions so you don't react defensively. The second thing is you need to listen to the ways in which you've offended them or done them wrong. The next thing is to acknowledge that mistake and then apologize. The next is to inquire how you should do better next time. So what went wrong? How can I change this? And then moving forward, commit to not doing it again. So again, in the moment, you need to keep yourself together. Don't react defensively. Listen, acknowledge and apologize. Inquire to how you can change. Move forward. And also, I'll add, don't linger on this. Once this has happened, move on. The longer you linger, the more awkward it becomes for everybody involved, and the worse that it gets. Now, the moving forward piece, yeah, that's when you need to not do this again with this person, but also most importantly, the next person that you encounter. That's where the reflection piece comes in to learn and do better. So this is something that might be helpful.
Excellent.
I really like that. I think that's a
Yeah.
useful tool.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are at 8:46, and I think as we do every week, and John, I really want to thank you for joining us. I think clearly we can look at doing a revisit of this topic in the new year, and then have you back if you'd be so willing to join us. But if we could, let's just close off with our standard big idea. I'm stretching for Jenny to get to the slide.
Okay, hold on 1 second. Oh, no, we're going backwards. Sorry.
Oh, there you go. That's okay.
No,
It's all good.
There we go. So our big idea we've seen already. John, I'm going to hand over to you and I'll try and keep up with your slides. It's coming through your 2 strategies that you sent us as well.
Sure.
Obviously this one we've seen, but maybe a little quick recap and that'll lead us in.
Yes, so the big idea to consider, inclusive leadership is a mindset that's based on at least these 6 traits. And now in practice, the strategies that you can apply it to would be the workplace climate or the culture, and also the organizational structures that I mentioned. So you'll see here a summation of the climate. You really want to understand your pain points in particular, like what is it that the discrimination happens most often, and then what can you do to act on those things. When it comes to structures, Jenny, if you want to go to the next one, hiring, promotion, and pay, policy, procedure, and budgets. What gets measured gets acted on, what gets funded gets done. These are really common things that we hear. But also someone mentioned in here your external partners and relationships. It's about the communities you serve and also about your procurement. How do you buy? What are you buying? Whom do you buy it from? Those kinds of things. And then the last thing, those 3 questions we can leave you with. This is about when you make a mistake. The claim model really lives in these 3 pieces here. So ask yourself, what went wrong? Why did it go wrong? And then what would I do differently next time?
Perfect.
Perfect. Yeah, absolutely. So thank you so much for joining us, John, and we will be back in January. This has been a really fun run since June until now, and Jenny and I certainly want to thank everybody who has joined us on a regular basis. We'll be back in January. We're going to talk about performance goals, not about New Year's resolutions, because everybody will have broken theirs by January 14th. And then as we get to the end of January, mental toughness, perhaps maybe to ensure your performance goals are on track or to revisit your resolutions. But we will send out some follow-up materials here. Again, would love everybody, as Jenny is throwing on the slide here and I threw in the chat, we just recently launched a new LinkedIn page for state corporate training. Please, if you're so inclined, give it a follow. You'll see all the information on upcoming webinars there. And with that, have a fantastic December, a safe holiday season, and a happy new year. So take care, everybody. Thanks again, John. Thanks, Jenny.
Absolutely. Thank you, John. Goodbye, everybody. Have a good holiday. Take care.
Take care.